The sun hung high in the sky as Sarah walked through the bustling streets of the city, the cool autumn breeze tugging at her jacket. She had always loved the crisp air this time of year, the way it seemed to clear her mind. Today was special. It wasn't just another shopping trip, it was a celebration. Serena, her best friend, had invited her to Luxe Couture, an upscale boutique that catered to the city's elite, for a private event. Sarah had never been inside such a store, but Serena, a successful businesswoman with connections to the high society, had insisted it would be fun. As they entered the boutique, Sarah marveled at the sheer opulence of the place. The floors were polished to perfection, and rows of carefully curated designer dresses hung on the walls, their tags almost gleaming with exclusivity. It wasn't a place that catered to ordinary customers. The lights were soft, casting a halo over everything, making even the simplest of clothes seem like works of art. Serena, dressed to perfection in a tailored coat, was already at ease, greeting the store's staff with the familiarity of someone who belonged. Sarah, however, felt out of place. She didn't belong to this world of glimmering fabrics and high prices. The invitation had come as a surprise, and though she was grateful, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't meant to be here. Her fingers lightly brushed the silk hangers as she tried to make herself as invisible as possible. Her daughter, Kayla, skipped ahead, her laughter filling the store as she chased after a pair of white children, friends of Serena's who were also there with their parents. The luxury of the boutique had a way of making everything seem just a little more surreal, a little more distant. Sarah walked slowly, keeping a careful distance from the racks of clothing. She didn't want to be judged by others who might see a black woman in this expensive space with children who weren't even hers. Still, it wasn't her place to care. She had been invited after all. In the far corner of the boutique, Clarissa stood at her post, monitoring the customers as they browsed. The store was always filled with the elite, and Clarissa was accustomed to serving the same wealthy faces, the city's businessmen, the socialites, the ones who wore brands that Sarah only ever saw in magazines. She had been working at Luxe Couture for years, developing a sharp eye for spotting who truly belonged and who didn't. When she first noticed Sarah entering the store, there was something about the way the woman carried herself, the way she hesitated among the luxury goods, that caught Clarissa's attention. There was a subtle shift in the air as Sarah made her way through the boutique, the kind of shift that Clarissa couldn't explain but instinctively recognized. But it wasn't Sarah's uncertainty that caught Clarissa's eye. It was the children, the white children. They ran ahead, laughing as they chased each other between the clothing racks, while Kayla, the little black girl, stayed close behind them. Clarissa didn't know why, but the sight of a black woman with two white children in such an exclusive space unsettled her. It didn't sit right in her mind. What was she doing with them? Clarissa wondered, narrowing her eyes. Are they hers? Clarissa's eyes followed Sarah and the children as they moved toward the back of the store. She watched for a moment, her fingers unconsciously tightening on the counter. There was something about the situation that didn't make sense. It was a story she had seen play out in different ways before. The wealthy white clients always assumed a position of power in places like this, while others seemed to slip in and out unnoticed as if they didn't truly belong. Clarissa's thoughts turned bitter. She had worked here long enough to know who could afford the lifestyle and who was merely playing dress-up. Was this woman really someone who belonged here? Before she knew it, Clarissa had walked over, her polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. She approached Sarah, who was bending down to tie the shoe of one of the white children. Without hesitation, Clarissa spoke up, her tone sharp. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I help you with something?" Sarah, startled by the sudden interruption, stood up quickly, glancing at her daughter and the white children playing nearby. "Oh, no, thank you," she replied with a nervous smile. "We're just looking around." But Clarissa, Sarah felt the weight of the words, though they were not overtly harsh. The implication, however, was clear. She didn't belong. Her heart tightened, and she fought back the rush of emotions that threatened to boil over. She wanted to speak, to call out the injustice of it all, but something in her held her back. She glanced over at Serena, who was talking to another customer, blissfully unaware of the tension building in the air. Kayla, feeling the shift in the atmosphere, pulled on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, are we going to leave soon?" The question hit Sarah harder than she expected. Was that what she was supposed to do? Leave? To make sure she wasn't seen as a problem? To make herself small in a space that clearly wasn't meant for her? She took a deep breath, standing taller. Not today. "Thank you for your concern," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady but her patience thinning. "But I'm fine here." Clarissa's smile faltered slightly, but she masked it with another professional nod. "Of course, ma'am. I'll be here if you need anything." As Clarissa walked away, Sarah's eyes followed her, the weight of the interaction settling into the pit of her stomach. She hadn't expected the confrontation, but she knew it was far from over. The unspoken tension between the boutique's walls had already begun to creep into her thoughts. As Sarah walked further into the boutique, trying to ignore the unsettling encounter with Clarissa, her thoughts remained clouded. The space around her seemed too vast, too empty, as if it were designed to highlight her as an outsider rather than a welcomed guest. She glanced over at Kayla, who was now chatting animatedly with one of the white children about their favorite cartoons. Despite the awkwardness in the air, Sarah smiled at the innocence her daughter brought to every situation. But the unease didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew stronger, and she felt the pressure of being watched. Clarissa's gaze hadn't left Sarah for long. As Sarah moved deeper into the boutique, she noticed the sales associate whispering to another employee. They exchanged a few words, and Sarah, though not able to hear the exact conversation, felt the sting of their judgment. Her presence, the presence of a black woman in such an exclusive space, had triggered something. The whispered words traveled like an electric current, and it didn't take long for Sarah to realize that this wasn't just about her handling the merchandise. This was about perception, the way she was being perceived. The children were an afterthought, a simple mistake in their eyes, but the real problem was her. She wasn't meant to be there, at least not in the eyes of Clarissa and the others, who thought they had the right to define who belonged in this world of opulence. Her phone buzzed, bringing her back to reality. It was a message from Serena, who was still talking to other guests at the event. Serena was oblivious to the tension in the air, but Sarah couldn't let her in on everything. She didn't want to ruin the day for her friend, but the reality of the situation was gnawing at her. "Everything okay? We're in the back room when you're ready." The message seemed innocent enough, but Sarah couldn't ignore the heaviness in her chest. Did she belong here? She had every right to shop in any boutique, to walk into any store without fear of judgment, but today was different. Her skin, her identity, and her presence seemed to have made the world around her less welcoming, less friendly. She didn't know how long she could stand the looks, the whispers, the constant sense of being out of place. Clarissa, after seeing Sarah's hesitation, knew she had made a slight miscalculation. She had been trained to handle wealthy customers, and she could spot an outsider a mile away. But what had she just done? What had compelled her to treat Sarah like a problem before she even gave her a chance? Clarissa had seen many types of people come and go in this boutique, but Sarah and her children had felt different. There was something about this woman that didn't belong in the world she had come to know so well. The inner struggle waged in Clarissa's mind, but she would never admit it. Her professional demeanor was everything to her, and to break character now would only further expose her. She had a job to do, and it was easier to hold on to her bias than to face the difficult truth of what had just happened. As Sarah walked to the back of the store, Clarissa kept her distance but couldn't help herself from watching. Meanwhile, Sarah was aware of the eyes on her. It was subtle at first, just a fleeting glance, a slight turn of the head, but it was there, hanging in the air like a thread that tied her to something she didn't understand. The way the store's atmosphere shifted as she moved through it. It was undeniable. No, she didn't belong. Not here. Not in their eyes. Kayla's joyful chatter brought Sarah back to the present. She watched as the little girl skipped ahead, her innocence shining through the discomfort Sarah felt. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to feel the joy that had brought her here. She had spent her life working hard for her daughter's future, striving to give her a better life, a life of opportunities. And now, on this special day, she was supposed to enjoy the simple pleasure of shopping with a friend's children. But the unease gnawed at her, relentless. As she watched Kayla play with the other children, Sarah tried to steady herself. She had come too far to let this moment, this uncomfortable experience, define her day. But the constant weight of the stares, the whispers, and Clarissa's earlier reaction was impossible to ignore. At that moment, the boutique's door chimed as another customer walked in, their heels clicking on the marble floor. Sarah looked over, briefly meeting the eyes of the newcomer, a tall woman in a fur coat with a look of disdain. The woman didn't make eye contact with Sarah, but Sarah couldn't help but feel that the brief glance was somehow a silent judgment. Sarah's chest tightened. She didn't belong here, and she was beginning to understand why. The luxury, the exclusivity, the whispered judgments in every corner. It wasn't about class. It wasn't about money. It was about race. She took another deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to let it break her. She wasn't going to let them win. But deep down, Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The deeper she stepped into this world of designer clothes and elitism, the more she understood that her presence here wasn't just about shopping. It was about challenging everything this world had built around people like her. Sarah's nerves were on edge as the minutes dragged by, each one feeling heavier than the last. She could feel the eyes on her, from the employees, from the other customers. It was as though she didn't belong here, no matter how carefully she held herself, no matter how confident she tried to appear. Every step she took was met with a slight flick of the eyes, a moment of hesitation, as if she were somehow disrupting the perfect harmony of the boutique. The chatter of the other guests had faded into the background, and she could only focus on the soft clinking of hangers, the faint sound of the air conditioning, and the thudding of her heartbeat. Kayla, ever the curious one, continued playing with the other children, her laughter echoing through the otherwise silent space. It should have been a normal day, but as Sarah walked from one rack of clothes to another, trying to find something for herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The judgment hung in the air like a cloud. And then it happened. As Sarah reached for a cream-colored blouse, a delicate silk number that she would never have picked on her own. Not in a place like this, Kayla, in her excitement, accidentally bumped into one of the mannequins. The mannequin teetered, its perfectly arranged outfit swaying before the dress it wore slipped from its stand and fell to the floor with a sharp sound that cut through the silence. Sarah's heart sank as she heard the clatter. The boutique fell silent for a split second before murmurs spread throughout the store. Kayla gasped, her small hands flying to her mouth as she looked up at her mother wide-eyed. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice small and apologetic. Sarah turned quickly, kneeling down to her daughter's side. "It's okay, sweetie. It's just an accident." But inside, she felt the heat of embarrassment rising up her neck. Before she could make any effort to fix the situation, Clarissa was there, standing in front of them, her expression hard and unforgiving. Sarah looked up at her, but Clarissa didn't offer an apology or a hint of understanding. Instead, she stared down at the fallen dress, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Look what you've done," Clarissa said, her voice sharp, though she tried to keep it composed. "This dress is one of the store's most expensive pieces. It's not for children to play around with." Sarah's breath caught in her throat, the harshness of the words hitting her like a physical blow. Her initial instinct was to defend Kayla, to tell the saleswoman that it was an accident, that no harm had been intended. But Clarissa's stance was already cold, defensive. And in that moment, Sarah realized that it wasn't just about the dress. Clarissa wasn't looking at the situation as an accident. She was looking at Sarah, and Sarah could see the judgment in her eyes. This wasn't about a dress. It was about Kayla, about the two of them, standing in the boutique, making the store feel out of place. For a moment Sarah was silent, unsure of what to say. Kayla, seeing her mother's hesitation, tugged at her sleeve. "I'm really sorry, Mommy. I didn't mean to," she whispered, her face clouded with guilt. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She stood up and straightened her shoulders, meeting Clarissa's icy gaze. "It was an accident," Sarah said, her voice firm but controlled. "No harm was done. We're leaving." But before she could turn to gather Kayla and leave, Clarissa's voice cut through the air again. "Leaving? After causing all this trouble?" The disdain in her voice was unmistakable. "I suggest you think twice about coming into a store like this again." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt the sting of them deep within her chest. Again, as if she didn't belong here, as if she was just an unwelcome guest in this polished world. She took a step back, her eyes narrowing. She could feel the eyes of the other customers on her, could sense their judgment, even though they remained silent. It was as if they, too, were silently rooting for Clarissa. But Sarah wouldn't let it stand. She wasn't going to allow this woman, this store, to make her feel less than. Not today. Turning to Kayla, who was still standing nervously by her side, Sarah said, "It's okay, sweetheart. We're leaving now." But before they could walk away, Sarah glanced at Clarissa one last time. "You may have a certain idea about who belongs here, but I'm here because I have every right to be," she said, her voice steady. "And don't ever forget that." With that, Sarah took Kayla's hand and walked toward the door, feeling the stares of the room, following her every step. Clarissa stood in the background, her jaw clenched, the consequences of her actions slowly sinking in. As Sarah stepped out into the fresh air, the weight in her chest began to lift. But she knew it wasn't over. It wasn't just about this incident. It was about what came next. The fight to prove that she belonged in every space, no matter the whispers and the judgment of others. And as she walked away from the boutique, she made herself a promise. She would make them see her, and she would make them hear her. The evening air was cooler than Sarah had expected, and as she walked with Kayla down the street, she found herself fighting back tears. The sting of Clarissa's words had cut deeper than she realized, a reminder of how easily some people felt entitled to judge and dismiss her. The silence between her and Kayla was thick, the weight of the afternoon's encounter still hanging over them. Kayla skipped ahead, her small voice breaking the silence. "Mommy, are we going home now?" Sarah smiled softly, trying to push the anger away. "Yes, sweetie, we're going home." But as they walked, her mind kept returning to the incident. It wasn't just the slap of Clarissa's words that hurt. It was the realization that this world, this seemingly pristine world of luxury and exclusivity, wasn't made for her. The privilege that Clarissa carried with her wasn't just a matter of wealth or status. It was a privilege of being seen, of being recognized as someone who belonged. Sarah, on the other hand, had been made to feel invisible, even though she had every right to be there. The frustration burned inside her, but she didn't let it show. She didn't want Kayla to sense the anger, the hurt that Sarah was trying to keep buried. She wanted Kayla to have the innocence of her childhood, the joy of being carefree, without the weight of the world on her shoulders. But as they reached their car, Sarah's phone buzzed. Glancing down at it, she saw the name that immediately made her heart stop. Marcus. Marcus was her husband, the man who had built an empire from the ground up. He had been quiet during the whole ordeal, not because he wasn't supportive, but because he knew Sarah had to fight her own battles. But now, it seemed, the time for silence had passed. With a deep breath, Sarah answered the phone. "Marcus, is everything okay?" "I just got off the phone with Serena," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I know what happened today. You shouldn't have been treated like that." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Serena had called him? Of course she had. But she hadn't expected Marcus to get involved in this way. "Marcus, it's fine. I don't want you to—" "No," Marcus interrupted. "It's not fine. You've been wronged, Sarah. I'm not going to sit by and let that happen." There was a pause, and Sarah could hear the weight of his words. "I've already made some calls." Sarah's heart raced. She knew what calls meant. Marcus wasn't just any businessman. He was influential in ways she hadn't even begun to comprehend. His connections reached across industries, across countries. When he made calls, things changed. "Marcus, I don't want this to escalate. It's not about them. It's about what's right." "I understand that," Marcus replied, his voice softening. "But sometimes fighting for what's right means taking action, not just letting things slide." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, leaning against the car. She hadn't expected this, but part of her knew it was inevitable. She had never been one to back down from a fight, but Marcus, with his resources, his influence, had the power to make things happen in ways she never could. He could take down an entire system if he wanted to. But Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to use his power this way. She hadn't asked for it. She had fought this battle on her own for a reason. But as she thought about the way Clarissa had looked at her, the way her daughter had been treated, she felt something shift inside her. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I appreciate it, but I need to do this my way. I need to take this to the people. I don't want anyone to think I'm using you to fight my battles." "I understand, Sarah," Marcus said after a pause, "but don't forget, you're not alone in this." The conversation ended with a promise to follow up later, but as Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a mix of emotions. Marcus was powerful, and she had no doubt that he could make things right in an instant. But was that the kind of change she wanted? She didn't want to rely on his name or influence to force an apology from someone who had wronged her. She wanted change that came from the ground up, from within. And yet, deep down, Sarah knew that this fight wasn't just about one moment in a boutique. It was about something much larger, a system that had been built to silence people like her, to keep them in their place. If she had to fight it alone, then so be it. But if Marcus was willing to back her, to lend his strength to the cause, then maybe they could do more than just correct one wrong. Maybe they could change the system itself. As Sarah looked over at Kayla, she smiled. "Let's go home," she said, her voice steady. "We've got work to do." The following days were a whirlwind for Sarah. She couldn't shake the events from Luxe Couture out of her mind. The way Clarissa had treated her, the way Kayla had looked up at her with confusion, and the feeling of being judged solely for her skin color. It all weighed heavily on her, but there was more to it now. There was a sense of purpose that Sarah hadn't expected to find, something much deeper than just the need for justice in a single boutique. Marcus had reached out to her several times since their phone conversation, but Sarah wasn't ready to accept his help, at least not in the way he had intended. His influence could easily wipe away Clarissa's actions, but that wouldn't address the root of the problem. It wouldn't change the system that had allowed Clarissa's behavior to exist unchecked. Sarah wanted to fight this battle herself, to show that the change she sought couldn't be bought or coerced, but earned. Serena, though supportive, could tell Sarah was struggling with how to handle the aftermath. She had called multiple times to check in, but it wasn't until she showed up at Sarah's apartment that Sarah finally allowed herself to break down. She didn't want to talk about it at first, but Serena wasn't going to leave until she did. They sat on the couch, and for the first time since the incident, Sarah let her guard down. "Why does this still hurt so much?" Sarah whispered, her hands trembling in her lap. "It's just one boutique, just one woman. But why does it feel like it's everything?" Serena leaned forward, her eyes soft with understanding. "Because it's not just about Clarissa or the store. It's about everything that came before, everything that will come after. It's about a world that makes you feel like you don't belong, no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you achieve." Sarah wiped her eyes and nodded. Serena was right. The store, the incident, it was only the latest in a long line of experiences that had tried to push Sarah into the background. But now something inside her had shifted. She realized that she had been fighting this battle alone for too long, accepting small injustices because she felt like it was the only way to survive. "I want to make them see me," Sarah said, her voice quiet but determined. "I don't want them to just apologize. I want them to understand that this isn't something I can just move on from. It's not just a personal hurt. It's bigger than that. It's about everything I've had to endure just to be treated like everyone else." Serena gave her a supportive smile, one that said she understood exactly what Sarah meant. "And I'll be here with you every step of the way. You've already shown them what you're capable of, Sarah. You're stronger than you think." The words were comforting, but Sarah knew that this battle wasn't about strength alone. It was about strategy. If she wanted to truly make a difference, she would have to dig deeper than just personal vindication. The real question was how to take her own pain and turn it into a force for change that could reach beyond this one instance. As Sarah spent the next few days reflecting, the plan began to form. She would use her experience to shine a light on a larger issue, the issue of racial discrimination in spaces that were meant to be inclusive, like luxury retail. She would build a platform not just for herself, but for others who had suffered in silence, for those who didn't have the power or the voice to fight back. But Sarah also knew that there would be opposition. She could already feel the resistance building. Some people would try to dismiss her as an angry victim, while others would try to silence her altogether. She couldn't let that happen. Not this time. As she stood by the window of her apartment, looking out at the city below, Sarah felt the weight of what was to come. This fight wasn't just about one boutique, one employee, or even one event. It was about something much larger. It was about creating a world where people like her could exist in spaces of privilege without having to fight for their right to belong. She was no longer just a victim of the system. She was determined to break it. The days following Sarah's decision were filled with a quiet yet determined energy. She spent her time carefully planning, reflecting on the next steps she needed to take. The court case had been one thing, a powerful moment of personal triumph, but Sarah had never seen it as the end of the journey. It was only the beginning, and now, more than ever, she felt ready to turn her pain into a weapon for change. It wasn't long before the investigation into Luxe Couture began. Serena, with her connections in both legal and business circles, had set the wheels in motion. Together they'd contacted lawyers, civil rights organizations, and other allies who had been willing to lend their voices to Sarah's cause. But this wasn't just about one instance of mistreatment in a boutique. It was about addressing the bigger issue of systemic racism in high-end retail spaces and the deep-rooted prejudices that existed in the world of luxury. Sarah had long known that discrimination wasn't limited to the police force or schools. It existed in every corner of society. Luxury boutiques were no exception. She had seen it in the way certain customers were treated with respect and deference, while others, like her, were treated as though they didn't belong. The experience in Luxe Couture was just the latest example of how the powerful and privileged had learned to look the other way when it came to the inequalities faced by people like Sarah. But now, with legal support and the media paying attention, Sarah could see a way forward. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the countless others who had been silenced for far too long. The legal team was small but efficient. They began by collecting evidence, witness statements, surveillance footage from the boutique, and a record of Sarah's interactions with Clarissa. Sarah had already been able to provide a detailed account of what had happened, but now they needed more. They needed to show that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern of discrimination within the store. Meanwhile, the boutique's owners were scrambling to defend their actions. At first, they tried to brush the incident aside, claiming that it was simply a misunderstanding, a one-time mistake. But Sarah's legal team wasn't buying it. They pushed for deeper investigations into Luxe Couture's policies and hiring practices. They subpoenaed employee records looking for evidence of bias in the company's decision-making process, and they began speaking to other employees about the culture inside the store. One afternoon, while Sarah was meeting with her legal team to discuss the progress of the investigation, she received a message from Marcus. Her heart sank as she read it. It was brief, just a few words. "They're trying to sweep it under the rug. We need to make it bigger." Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew that Marcus was right. The boutique's owners were powerful, and they had every resource at their disposal to make the incident disappear. If they could downplay it, they would. And that would only add to the cycle of injustice. But Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. This had to be bigger than one boutique, one employee, or even one case. This was about holding the entire luxury retail industry accountable. As she thought about her next steps, Sarah was struck by the realization that the public's attention was shifting. She had used her platform to speak out, but now it was time for something more. The media had covered her case, but what would happen once the story faded from the headlines? Sarah didn't want to be just a story. She wanted to be the voice for systemic change, for an industry that had long ignored the real impact of its biases. But for now, the investigation had to be the focus. The more Sarah and her team pushed, the more they uncovered subtle cues of racial bias in the boutique's training programs, employees admitting to racial profiling in customer service, and policies that, on paper, claimed to promote inclusivity, but in practice, failed to live up to their ideals. Every new revelation only fueled Sarah's resolve. As the investigation gained momentum, Sarah knew that it wasn't just about proving a point in court. It was about shifting the culture of an entire industry. She had the chance to not only expose the inequities in Luxe Couture, but to challenge the broader narrative that allowed such spaces to thrive on exclusion. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But Sarah was ready. The world might have underestimated her, but she was about to show them just how powerful a single voice could be. As Sarah's team dug deeper into the investigation, the story that had started with one isolated incident began to unfold into something much larger. The legal documents stacked high on Sarah's desk were not just a pile of evidence. They were a window into a system built to maintain power at the expense of those who didn't belong to its elite circle. It wasn't just about Clarissa's actions or Luxe Couture's failure to uphold its own policies. It was about a pattern that ran through the heart of luxury retail. Sarah spent hours poring over the evidence, her mind working through the case step by step. Clarissa's behavior, though blatant, was just a small piece of the puzzle. The more they uncovered about Luxe Couture, the more Sarah realized how deeply ingrained racism was within its structure. It wasn't just an employee issue, it was a corporate culture problem. Every employee who worked there, from the associates to the managers, had been trained to look at people like Sarah and assume they didn't belong. The company's internal training materials were damning. They talked about client profiles, which were often vague and discriminatory, subtly teaching employees to prioritize certain types of customers over others based on their appearance and financial status. The more Sarah read, the more she could see that this was how the system worked, how it kept people like her daughter, out. But it wasn't just the policies that were problematic. It was the culture. Interviews with former employees painted a stark picture of a work environment that rewarded favoritism and perpetuated bias. One former manager, speaking anonymously, described how the store would frequently hold exclusive events, but only for a select few customers, the ones who met the right profile, who had the right skin color, the right income bracket. Those who didn't fit the mold were quietly pushed aside, often without ever being given a chance. Sarah could feel the anger rising inside her as she read through these accounts. This wasn't just about her. This was about everyone who had ever been turned away, dismissed, or ignored, simply because they didn't fit a certain image. This was about a system that was designed to keep people like her in their place. But Sarah wasn't going to let it continue. The legal team was now working around the clock, gathering as much information as possible to build a case that would bring the whole structure down. It wasn't just about winning. It was about forcing a change, making sure that no one would ever feel like Sarah had felt that day in Luxe Couture again. Serena, who had been her unwavering support throughout this process, was starting to see the weight of what they were up against. She was now on board with everything Sarah was doing, even if it meant stepping into the spotlight herself. While she had always supported Sarah from behind the scenes, Serena understood that this fight needed more than just legal backing. It needed visibility, public support, and the kind of exposure that could bring real, tangible change. As the case gained attention, more people came forward. Former employees, customers, and even those who had once shopped at Luxe Couture began to share their stories. Some described being followed around the store. Others recalled being treated like second-class citizens simply because they didn't fit the boutique's image of who deserved to shop there. The media, which had initially been skeptical of the case, began to rally behind Sarah. The public outcry grew as people across the city, and even across the country, voiced their support for Sarah and her mission. What had started as a personal fight had evolved into a nationwide conversation about race, privilege, and the insidious nature of discrimination in places that prided themselves on being inclusive and elite. Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The investigation was still ongoing and the legal battles were far from over, but the momentum was on their side now. The world was starting to take notice, and the more people spoke out, the more the system began to crack. Sarah wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or judged. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she could breathe. The fight wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about rewriting the rules, changing the way the world saw people like her. As she sat in her office looking over the stacks of documents that were slowly coming together, Sarah realized that this was her moment. The fight was big, the stakes were high, and the road ahead was uncertain, but she had never been more determined in her life. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Sarah found herself standing outside the courtroom, her stomach a whirlwind of nerves. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the weight of what she was about to do hit her harder than expected. This wasn't just a case about a personal wrong. This was the beginning of something much larger. The courtroom doors loomed before her, and she could hear the murmurs of people inside. Lawyers, journalists, onlookers, all waiting for the proceedings to begin. Beside her, Serena placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've got this, Sarah," she said softly, her voice steady. "This is the moment. You're doing what's right." Sarah nodded, but inside she could feel the tension building. She had been in tough situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just about defending herself. It was about speaking for those who couldn't speak for themselves, for those who had been silenced for far too long. As they entered the courtroom, Sarah's eyes scanned the room. Clarissa, the woman who had struck Kayla, was already seated at the defendant's table. She looked almost unrecognizable, her once confident posture now replaced by an air of anxiety. Her lawyer, a well-dressed man with an air of arrogance, sat beside her, flipping through legal documents with practiced ease. Sarah's gaze narrowed. She knew Clarissa was just the tip of the iceberg. Sarah took a deep breath and walked toward her seat. The judge, a middle-aged man with silver hair and a sharp gaze, called the court to order. The proceedings began with formalities, but Sarah could already feel the intensity of the atmosphere. There was something in the air, something that told her this was going to be a battle, not just for justice in her case, but for something bigger. The first round of testimony was filled with technicalities as both sides presented their arguments. Clarissa's lawyer argued that the incident was a misunderstanding, that the altercation had been an accident, and that Sarah's emotional response was exaggerated. He painted Sarah as an angry woman, one who had overreacted to a minor issue. His words felt like poison to Sarah's ears, and she fought to maintain her composure. But Sarah was ready. When it was her turn to testify, she stood tall, her heart pounding as she faced the room. The jury's eyes were on her, and she knew this was the moment. She couldn't let them see her as a victim. She had to show them the bigger picture. "I wasn't just struck because of an accident," Sarah began, her voice steady. "I wasn't just hit for no reason. What happened in that boutique was the result of a system that treats people like me as less than. The real issue here is that Clarissa and people like her think it's acceptable to treat me and my daughter this way simply because of the color of our skin. The way we were spoken to, the way we were treated, was not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem." Sarah paused, letting her words sink in. She could feel the weight of what she was saying, but she also knew this was the truth. The case wasn't just about this one moment. It was about the years of microaggressions, the subtle and not so subtle discrimination she had faced her entire life. Clarissa's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge quickly silenced him. Sarah took a breath and continued, her words stronger now. "It wasn't just about the slap. It was about the assumption that I didn't belong there, that I wasn't entitled to be in that space. The boutique wasn't just selling clothes. It was selling an image of who belonged and who didn't. And I was not part of that image. But I have a right to be there just as much as anyone else." The courtroom was silent. Sarah could feel the weight of her words settling in the room. This wasn't just about proving a point to Clarissa or her lawyer. It was about showing everyone in that room that this was bigger than any one instance. This was about a system that had allowed racism to persist unchecked, a system that needed to change. Clarissa sat frozen, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Sarah didn't look at her. She didn't need to. She knew what this fight was really about. After a few more minutes of cross-examination, the defense rested. Sarah's heart was still pounding, but she felt a sense of resolve she hadn't known she could have. The rest of the day was spent reviewing evidence, but Sarah's testimony had already planted the seed. she had told her story, and it had resonated. As the day came to a close, Sarah left the courtroom with Serena by her side, both of them exhausted but hopeful. The fight was far from over, but Sarah knew she had made her point, and now it was time to see if the world was ready to listen. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the jury deliberated behind closed doors. Sarah sat quietly, her fingers nervously tapping on the wooden table. She had given everything, her testimony, her emotions, her truth, and now all she could do was wait. The wait felt like an eternity, each passing minute heavier than the last. The room was filled with tension, and Sarah could feel every moment stretching out, each second building on her anxiety. Beside her, Serena shifted in her seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Serena had been a pillar of support throughout this entire ordeal, but now even she seemed restless. They had worked so hard to get to this point, to push for accountability and justice, but would it be enough? It wasn't just about the slap anymore. It wasn't even about the incident in Luxe Couture. It was about sending a message, one that would ripple out far beyond this courtroom, far beyond just the people who had witnessed this moment. This was about changing the system, about showing that discrimination in any form could no longer be tolerated. Sarah didn't expect the world to change overnight, but she knew that this verdict, whatever it would be a turning point. If she won, it would be a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced by the weight of prejudice. If she lost, it would be a crushing defeat, but she would not give up. Not now. Minutes ticked by, and then the door to the jury room opened. A hush fell over the courtroom. The jury emerged, their expressions unreadable, each of them holding a piece of paper in their hands. The judge called the court to order, and everyone stood as the foreman of the jury stepped forward to deliver the verdict. The air seemed to hold its breath, every eye on the foreman, every heart pounding. We, the jury, find the defendant, Clarissa Matthews, guilty of assaulting the plaintiff, Sarah Roberts, the foreman declared, his voice clear and firm. We also find that the actions of Luxe Couture contributed to a culture of discrimination that enabled such behavior. We recommend that the boutique be held accountable for its practices and policies. The room seemed to erupt. The weight of the moment crashed down on Sarah, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to exhale. The tears that had been building up in her eyes finally broke free, but they were not tears of defeat. They were tears of relief, of vindication. Serena, unable to hold back her own emotions, embraced Sarah tightly. The entire room seemed to breathe again, and Sarah could feel the heat of the moment, the power of the verdict, settle deep within her chest. The fight was not over, but this was a victory, and it was one that felt impossible just weeks ago. Clarissa's face was pale, her jaw set tight. Her lawyer stood beside her, silent as the reality of the verdict sank in. Sarah watched as Clarissa's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. Perhaps fear, perhaps shame, or maybe even a hint of regret. But Sarah didn't care about her feelings anymore. It was over for her. The judge's gavel came down with a finality that seemed to shake the room. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff. Luxe Couture is hereby ordered to pay restitution and begin a full review of its hiring and customer service practices. It wasn't just a win for Sarah. It was a win for the countless others who had experienced the same or worse, those who had been left behind in the shadows. It was a reminder that the fight against racism, against prejudice, was real, and that it mattered. As Sarah stood up, her heart still racing, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't anticipated. She had fought for something bigger than herself, and it had paid off. But more than that, she had exposed the cracks in a system that had long been unchallenged. and she had made them impossible to ignore. Serena squeezed her hand, her voice filled with emotion. "You did it, Sarah. You really did it." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "We did it." The courtroom buzzed with the echoes of the verdict, but outside, the world was different. Sarah stepped out into the bright sunlight, the warmth of the day brushing against her face, yet she felt a coolness settle in her chest. The victory, though sweet, was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done. The media had already caught wind of the case. By the time Sarah had stepped out of the courtroom, a small crowd of reporters had gathered outside. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and the questions began to fly. "Sarah, how does it feel to win today? Do you think this verdict will change the industry? What are your plans for the future? Will you be pursuing further action against Luxe Couture?" Sarah paused, feeling the weight of the questions hanging in the air. She had always known that this moment would come, the public spotlight, the inevitable rush of attention that followed any high-profile case. She had spent months preparing herself for this, but now, standing at the threshold of her newfound visibility, it felt overwhelming. The eyes of the world were on her, and she had to speak for more than just herself. She took a deep breath and faced the cameras, her heart steadying with every passing second. "This isn't just a victory for me," Sarah said, her voice calm but resolute. "This is for everyone who has been silenced, for everyone who has ever been made to feel less than, simply because of who they are. We've won today, but the fight doesn't stop here. It's about holding spaces accountable. It's about dismantling the systems that allow discrimination to thrive, and it's about ensuring that this never happens again." The reporters scribbled down notes, their cameras clicking furiously, but Sarah didn't feel the need to say more. She had made her point. Behind her, Serena gave her a supportive smile, her eyes full of pride. "You did it, Sarah! You really did it!" But Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. She had been given a platform, and now she had a responsibility. She couldn't let this moment pass without pushing for further change. As important as this victory was, it was just a single step toward the transformation she envisioned. Sarah knew that she had to make the most of this moment, not just for herself, but for the countless others who were still fighting battles in silence. The next few days passed in a blur. Sarah met with legal experts, civil rights activists, and journalists who wanted to know more about her journey, her fight, and her vision for the future. But even as the story gained more traction, Sarah felt a persistent sense of urgency. The victory in court had been a powerful blow against the systemic racism that had plagued the retail industry. But now she needed to translate that momentum into real, lasting change. Her mind kept returning to the issues she had uncovered during the investigation. It wasn't just about Luxe Couture. It was about the luxury industry as a whole. Sarah knew that she had to push for more transparency, more inclusivity, and more accountability in every corner of the industry, not just in one boutique. But she also knew that these changes wouldn't come easily. The systems of privilege and power were deeply rooted, and those who benefited from them weren't going to give them up without a fight. As Sarah worked tirelessly to shape her strategy, she found herself having to confront her own doubts. Was she prepared for the long road ahead? Was she ready to take on the entire system? The answer, of course, was yes. Sarah had already fought too hard, sacrificed too much to back down now. She was committed to this fight, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stop her. As she sat in her office late one evening, staring out at the city below, she knew that this was only the beginning. There was much more to be done. But the thought of the change she could bring, the lives she could impact, filled her with a sense of purpose that had never been stronger. And as she thought about the road ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She would keep fighting not just for herself, but for all the people who had been forced to the edges of society, silenced by the oppressive forces of prejudice and discrimination. This victory was hers, but it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The weeks following the courtroom victory had been a whirlwind. Sarah's life had changed in ways she hadn't anticipated, yet it was the kind of change she had been waiting for. The media, the public, and even the luxury industry were all paying attention to her story. But Sarah didn't see it as the end. It was simply the beginning of something larger. She had fought to expose the cracks in a broken system, and now the challenge was to ensure those cracks didn't remain unnoticed. But with the newfound visibility came a new set of responsibilities. The pressure weighed on her, especially as the media coverage of her case continued. She had become a symbol of defiance, a person who stood up against injustice, someone who proved that the power of one voice could make a difference. The thought was both humbling and overwhelming. Sarah had never imagined herself to be a figure of such influence, but she had earned that title, and with it, she knew she had to deliver. Serena remained by her side, offering unwavering support as they both navigated the media frenzy. Together, they began strategizing the next steps. The momentum Sarah had gained needed to be channeled into something that would outlast the headlines and the public attention. This couldn't just be another case that fizzled out after the spotlight moved elsewhere. Sarah's next move was clear: advocacy. She began working with civil rights organizations and other activists who had been fighting against systemic racism in retail, hospitality, and other industries for years. The goal was to amplify their work and push for lasting change, not just through legal means, but through cultural and systemic reform. It wasn't just about winning one case anymore. It was about reshaping how the industry and society as a whole viewed racial equality. But as Sarah prepared for her next steps, there was a nagging feeling that kept pulling at her. She had won her battle with Luxe Couture, but the industry she was up against was vast. And it wasn't just about changing one store's policies. The systemic racism that had been ingrained in luxury retail, the subtle biases that influenced hiring, customer interactions, and even marketing strategies, ran deep. She knew that to truly make a difference, she had to broaden the scope of her fight. In her quiet moments, Sarah often thought about the families and individuals who faced the same prejudices she had, but without the resources or the support she had received. It was easy for someone with her platform to make waves, but what about the people who didn't have the same power, the same voice? That was where Sarah wanted to focus her energy next, on building a movement that could elevate those who had been silenced. The first step was to reach out to allies within the retail industry, people who were willing to take a stand and work toward change. There were executives, employees, and customers who had witnessed the same inequities but had been too afraid to speak up. Sarah knew that the system couldn't change until those in positions of power acknowledged their complicity and made a concerted effort to address the problem. She was no longer willing to accept lip service or vague promises of diversity. She wanted actionable steps, tangible results. One evening, as Sarah sat in her office, her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. It had been a while since they had spoken about the case, but Sarah had a feeling this message wasn't just about checking in. "I've been following everything closely. There's an opportunity to meet with a few major industry players, top-level executives in luxury retail. They want to talk about change. I think it's time we take this conversation to the next level. Let me know what you think." Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing. It was the opportunity she had been waiting for, but it came with its own set of challenges. Meeting with powerful executives could mean gaining the support of those who held the keys to real change. But it could also mean facing opposition, and the reality was that many of these companies were not interested in disrupting their profit-driven models. The decision wasn't easy. Sarah had fought hard for this moment, but the idea of sitting across from people who had upheld these systems for years made her uneasy. She wasn't sure if they were ready to confront the truth. But then Sarah thought back to all the people who had reached out to her, to all the messages of support from those who had silently suffered for years. She couldn't back down now. She couldn't afford to let fear control her. This was a chance to push for systemic change on a larger scale, to use her platform to make an even bigger impact. She took a deep breath and responded to Marcus, "Let's do it." And just like that, Sarah knew that her fight was about to enter a new phase. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the countless others who had been dismissed, ignored, and silenced. The real work was about to begin, and Sarah was ready to face whatever came next. The meeting room was sleek and modern, a testament to the power that lay behind the walls of the high-rise building. Glass windows stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the city below. Sarah sat at one end of the table, her palms flat against the cool surface. Across from her sat a group of executives, all well-dressed, polished, and powerful. They had come from some of the largest luxury retail chains in the world, brands that were the epitome of exclusivity. But today, they weren't here for business as usual. Today, they were here because of Sarah. She had always been aware of the world that lay beyond these walls, the world where decisions were made in boardrooms like this one, where strategies were forged that would determine the future of entire industries. But never in a million years had she imagined that she, a black woman, would sit at this table, challenging the very systems that had oppressed her and so many others for so long. The room was silent for a moment, and Sarah could feel the weight of the stairs. She had fought hard to get to this point, but now that she was here, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The stakes were higher than ever, and the eyes of the industry were on her. If she was going to make a real difference, she needed to speak with clarity and confidence. "Thank you all for agreeing to meet today," Sarah began, her voice calm but steady. "I'm here because I believe change is possible. But it has to come from within. You're the ones who shape the industry, who dictate the standards that millions follow. And right now, the industry is broken. It's exclusionary, biased, and quite frankly, it's built on a foundation of privilege." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the executives. They didn't look shocked. They didn't seem surprised at all. But Sarah could see the subtle shifts in their expressions, the way some of them tightened their jaws, the way others shifted in their seats. This wasn't the typical conversation they were used to having. Racism doesn't only exist in the places we see it, in the open displays of hate. It exists in the policies you implement, in the training you provide, in the way your employees are taught to prioritize certain customers over others. It exists in the unconscious biases that guide decision-making at every level of your business, Sarah continued, her words growing bolder. One of the executives, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, leaned forward. "You're accusing our companies of being racist?" His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it. He wasn't hostile, but he wasn't backing down either. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm simply stating the truth. Your companies have perpetuated a system that upholds racial discrimination, whether intentionally or not, and you've done so because it benefits you." The room shifted as the executives exchanged glances. Sarah could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't going to be easy. These were not people who had ever been made to confront the darker sides of their business practices. They were accustomed to being revered, to being seen as untouchable. But Sarah wasn't afraid to challenge them. She wasn't here for pleasantries. She was here to make them face the uncomfortable truth. We're all aware of the social pressures of the moment, the man with the salt and pepper hair said, his tone a little defensive now. But we're a business, not a social justice organization. We have customers to think about. And I understand that, Sarah replied quickly, but you can't keep thinking that just because something is profitable, it's right. Your customers are being sold a fantasy, one where only a certain kind of person is seen as worthy. You market your clothes to people who fit a certain image, while excluding those who don't. That's not just bad business, it's harmful. Another executive, a woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke up. So what do you suggest? A complete overhaul of our company policies. Do you really think that's feasible or realistic? Sarah took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy, but it had to happen. Yes, she said, her voice steady. I believe a complete overhaul is necessary, but it won't be easy. It'll require a commitment from every level of your organization. It'll require you to admit that these biases exist, even if you don't realize it. And it'll require you to actively change your practices, your hiring processes, your customer service. But I know it can be done. The silence in the room grew heavy. The executives were processing what Sarah had said, weighing her words, deciding what their next move would be. But Sarah didn't let the silence unnerve her. She stood her ground, knowing that this moment, this conversation, had the potential to spark real change. We've come a long way, Sarah continued, her voice calm and unwavering. But we've still got a long way to go. The real question is, will you be part of that change, or will you continue to perpetuate the cycle of inequality? The silence stretched for a few more seconds, and then finally, the man with the salt and pepper hair spoke again. His voice was quieter now, less defensive. We'll consider what you've said, Sarah, but we're going to need time. Sarah nodded, knowing that time was exactly what they had been wasting for far too long. She had said what needed to be said, and now it was up to them to decide if they were ready to change. The weeks that followed the meeting with the luxury retail executives felt like a slow, deliberate turning of gears. Sarah had made her case. She had spoken with conviction, and she had forced the industry's giants to look at themselves through a different lens. But would they follow through? Would the change she so desperately sought come to fruition, or would it all be a facade? Days turned into weeks, and Sarah remained in contact with the legal team, civil rights organizations, and the growing coalition of supporters who had rallied behind her cause. They were all waiting for the first signs of real action. The executives had promised to review their practices, to begin the process of overhauling their policies. But talk was cheap. It was time for results. One afternoon, while Sarah sat at her desk reviewing documents, she received an unexpected call from Marcus. His voice was steady, calm, but there was an unmistakable weight to his words. Sarah, I've got good news, Marcus said. We've been getting some feedback from the executives you met with. They're taking the steps you outlined seriously. Sarah sat up, her heart skipping a beat. Really? They're actually moving forward? They are, Marcus confirmed. They've already set up a committee to review their policies on inclusivity, hiring practices, and customer service. The first meeting is scheduled for next week. They've agreed to implement comprehensive anti-bias training for all employees, starting with their leadership teams. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was it, the start of the change she had been fighting for, the kind of change she had dreamed about since the incident in Luxe Couture. That's incredible, Sarah said, her voice filled with both disbelief and hope. But it's not just about training. They need to back this up with action, with transparency. We can't let this be just a box they check. I agree, Marcus said, and they're aware of that. They've committed to making their progress public. They're going to release quarterly reports on their diversity initiatives, and they'll be working with independent auditors to ensure their policies are being followed. Sarah exhaled slowly, the weight of the news sinking in. It was more than she had hoped for, but she knew that even this wasn't enough. This battle wasn't just about one company. It was about an entire industry, and Sarah had the power to push this momentum further. But first, she needed to take a moment to reflect. This wasn't just about luxe couture. This was about proving that change was possible, that the systems of inequality that had shaped her world could be dismantled piece by piece. This was a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been made to feel less than. As Sarah hung up the phone, her mind raced with possibilities. What could she do with this opportunity? What steps could she take to ensure this wasn't just a passing moment? There was so much more to be done. The next day, Sarah convened a meeting with her team. Together, they outlined a strategy to keep the pressure on, to ensure that this moment would have a lasting impact. They would continue to work with the executives, pushing them for further transparency, further accountability. But Sarah's vision went beyond just this boutique. She wanted to make this a movement. She wanted to change the entire luxury retail industry, to build a new standard, one where everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, could walk into any store and be treated with the respect they deserved. "We've started something," Sarah said, standing before her team. "But this is just the beginning. We can't let up now. The future depends on what we do next." The team nodded in agreement, their faces filled with determination. This wasn't just about making a statement. It was about changing the world, one step at a time. As Sarah left the meeting, she felt a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just a woman who had been wronged in a boutique. She wasn't just someone who had fought for justice in a single instance. She was a force for change, and this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever.